Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we're sitting down to discuss Bonjour, Tristesse by Françoise Sagan, the classic French novella that took France by storm with its publication in 1954. Sagan was only 17 when she wrote it, the same age as her narrator, teenager terrible Cécile, who is intent on separating her father from his new fiancée, the cool and sophisticated Anne.
An intimate look at love, sex, age and death, all set against the backdrop of a hot Mediterranean summer. Bonjour, Tristesse is the latest book read by my book club. What did we make of it? Has its ability to shock stood the test of time? Did it spark debate? Keep listening to find out.
I read Bonjour, Tristesse on holiday a few years ago and gobbled it up in an afternoon by the pool.
Oh, I had never read it.
How did you guys come to choose it?
Well, we wanted to do a classic. We'd just done The Vanishing Half, which was this brilliant, vivid, contemporary read. And for a change of pace, people wanted to do a classic. But, you know, then the classics that were being bandied around, it was like North and South weren't so long. People wanted to do a classic, but they didn't want to have to work really hard at reading a classic.
Yeah.
And so I suggested Bonjour, Tristesse. I had this really beautiful edition of it that I picked up off my mother-in-law's bookshelf. And when I asked her about it, I said, could I borrow that book? And she said, yeah. She said, I just have it because it's such a beautiful edition. And it is, because the book was published in 1952, and this one's 1958.
It was published in 1954, first published in the UK in 1955.
And so she wrote it when she was 17. It was published when she was 18. And by the time she was 19, it had become an international bestseller. And so part of the mystique of it, in a way, is almost as much to do with the author as it is the book itself. And it's quite interesting reading it. Is it worth it? Does it live up to that hype? And that was one of the things that we discovered, but maybe we should explain a little bit more about it before we weigh into the critical debate. We join Cécile, our heroine, and she's very jealous of her father's mistress. We learn that her mother died when she was very young. She then spent many years at boarding school before being taken in charge by her father. And then the two develop this very close relationship based on fun and irresponsibility. And both of them really are just interested in having a nice time.
Yes, and he's taking her out to parties in the demi-monde of Paris. She's quite young to be in this milieu, but is having a great time.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, she's quite clear-eyed about what she thinks he sees in her. She knows that he likes her because she's glamorous and she makes him look good. And he's definitely got an issue with, I think he's 40. He's not old, but definitely one of his issues is feeling like he's growing older and he's losing his glamour. So we join them at this villa that they've rented on the Riviera for the summer. And the father is there with his girlfriend, Elsa, who is very, very beautiful, but Cécile doesn't think that much of her because she's just not very bright. Another one of the themes that keeps cropping up in the novel is the relationship between beauty and intelligence. So you're kind of immediately plunged into this atmosphere. It's very vivid, it's very cinematic. I wasn't able to go away on holiday like a lot of people, actually, pretty like most people this year. I didn't make it to a beach. And so for me, this was just such a pleasure. I felt like I was lying on a beach of my own. You know, it's the scent of the pines, the kind of waft of the cigarette smoke. The heat. There's a young man called Cyril who turns up. He's got a yacht and he's sort of a student and he ends up being the boyfriend material, although she's not really interested in him. And so the stage is set. And then we meet Anne, who is known to Cécile. She's not a stranger. She's someone who's been connected with her father in the past.
She was a friend of her mother.
Was that the connection? And she's very sophisticated. She's very beautiful. She runs a fashion business and she tells Cécile she's brought herself down because she needs to have a break. She needs to have a rest. But Cécile realises quite quickly that actually what Anne's agenda is to form a relationship, a more permanent relationship with her father, and she sets about doing that, appearing in very, very beautiful dresses and basically doing everything she can to put the pretty but insipid Elsa to the shade.
And she's helped by the fact that Elsa has red hair and has a terrible sunburn.
Yeah.
That's one thing about this book. You don't usually think to find it in French novels, but it's quite funny in moments. I mean, Cécile's observations make you chuckle.
Yeah, definitely. You pulled that a little bit to read, didn't you? Which I think is nice to give people a sense of how atmospheric this writing is.
So one of the first things Anne does when she arrives is insist that Cécile study for her exams because she's failed and needs to take them again to achieve her baccalaureate. So Cecile is up in her room, supposed to be studying, and is really just fuming over the state of affairs. I thought of Cyril waiting for me down in the creek, of the swaying boat, of the pleasure of our kisses, and then I thought of Anne, but in a way that made me sit up on my bed with a fast-beating heart, telling myself that I was stupid, monstrous, nothing but a lazy, spoilt child, and had no right to have such thoughts. But all the same, in spite of myself, I continued to reflect that she was dangerous and that I must get rid of her. I thought of the lunch I had endured with clenched teeth, tortured by a feeling of resentment for which I despised and ridiculed myself. Yes, it was for this I reproached Anne. She prevented me from liking myself. I, who was so naturally meant for happiness and gaiety, had been forced by her into a world of self-criticism and guilty conscience, where, unaccustomed to introspection, I was completely lost. And what did she bring me? I took stock. She wanted my father, she had got him. She would gradually make of us the husband and stepdaughter of Anne Larson. That is to say, she would turn us into two civilized, well-behaved, and happy people.
So, at the heart of what seems to be upsetting Cecile about Anne is Anne's effort to exert some kind of control over her and her father. And actually, if you think about it, the way they behave, the father, he's pretty irresponsible. Cecile doesn't want to take any responsibility for herself. And even Elsa just sort of passively lies in the sun and gets sunburned. You know, they're all children. And Anne comes in and she's a grown-up. She's coming in, she's going to take control, she's going to sort them out. And so it's actually pretty benevolent. One of the things we were discussing is Anne really awful? Is she mean? Or is she in fact just trying to exert the kind of control that a loving mother would exert, which Cecile has never experienced? You know, she's never had that. You know, was that her crime, that she just came in and tried to be the kind of responsible parent that Cecile certainly doesn't get from her father? And so it's slightly, whose side are you on?
But I think it's really ambivalent. Yeah. And I think that ambivalence comes from the fact that Cecile herself can't quite decide if Anne is malevolent and cunning and cruel, or if she is just this loving woman who wants to look after them and make them happy.
She's such an unreliable narrator. Her emotions change from a moment to moment. You know, one time she's loathing Anne with every fibre of her being and plotting these kind of elaborate revenges. And then the next moment she's feeling contrite and loving towards her, and she just wants to be like her and emulate her and live this conventional bourgeois life that Anne is going to impose on them. She's so contradictory. But in that, I think, is its magic. This is what being 17 is like. We talked about, much like Sally Rooney, it seemed like she captured something of that state when you're 17 and you don't know anything about the world, really. You're completely self-obsessed because everyone is at 17, you know. And living in the moment, living for the pleasure of the boyfriend's kiss or the sun on the beach or the cigarette or whatever. I don't know. I found it all very seductive. Some people in my book club were kind of happily swept away, as I was. I have to say, Sally was a strong voice of discontent. She just said, I was so over all her teenage angst. I didn't care. And she'd read it before, so she knew the plot.
Yeah.
Interesting question for you, actually. You know, if you've read it before and you know the plot, is there enough then to pull you through? And for Sally, there just wasn't, she said. You know, she was really quite relieved to get to the end of it, even though it's like 100 pages, it's 120 pages, this book. It's so short.
I was the opposite. I sat down to reread it and was swept away. Like, as you say, how could you not want to be in this world? It's so beautiful and warm and sunny and carefree.
Well, I think it wasn't so much the setting as the company that's kind of irritated Sally. I mean, for me, the really fascinating thing about this book is the characters are paper thin. It's full of coincidences and plot contrivances that you just see through a mile away. All of the things that normally would really, really, really bother me and spoil my enjoyment of reading something. With this, strangely, I just didn't mind. I felt like the whole thing was sort of done with such panache. You know? You find yourself thinking it's also stylish and just lovely. And yet it feels like there is somehow this substance to it, because there is something about it that does feel enduring, whether it's this sense of this sort of youthful state that she's in, the strange power dynamics going on. It's all quite interesting and absorbing.
You know, there's something very much of Call Me By Your Name in it.
Yes, I thought of that.
That obsessive love that you get consumes you when you're young.
What's really fascinating, she's actually strangely detached. And in fact, I would flag up, there's a book called Revoir, Tristesse by Viv Groskop, which I've talked about before on the podcast. This is a book where she talks about various different French writers, and it's great. She just decodes the works for you, and it's very entertaining and interesting. It's like a whistle-stop tour of the classics of French literature. She begins with Françoise Sagan, and indeed I think that was very much the inspiration for the title and writing the book. And she said, there's something almost close to the psychopathic portrait of Patrick Bateman in American Psycho in Bonjour, Tristesse. Cécile says she only cares about happiness, but she also seems to observe psychological states as if from a distance, almost as if they're a pantomime for her. On Anne and Raymond. I wonder if it's like Raymond.
Yeah, probably Raymond.
Not Raymond. They were both smiling and looking happy. I was impressed by that. Happiness has always seemed to me to be a validation, to represent a successful outcome. Sometimes she seems to be parroting the thoughts and feelings of others. She was gradually going to make of us the husband and daughter of Anne Larson, which meant that we would become civilised, well-mannered, happy people, for she would make us happy. It does have that kind of strange detachment. And we talked about the talented Mr. Ripley as well.
Okay.
You can almost read this deeply psychologically disturbing kind of element to it in a way.
But you know what? I don't see that. I just see her being a self-absorbed teenager who's very, very put out that this woman has entered her life and is controlling her. And I actually found myself on her side quite a lot.
Yeah.
I found Anne really annoying. And I was one of those teenagers who couldn't wait to grow up because I hated people telling me what I could and could not do. You know, not rebellious, but if anyone told me what to do, I would just get completely worked up. My mum always said, I never crossed you. There were ways to get around you, but I never crossed you. And I just found that Anne goes about it all wrong. Like, who is she to come in and kind of impose herself on them?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree, but it's true that, you know, there are lots of different ways of interpreting it, and people had lots of different reactions, which is what made it, surprisingly for me, a really good book club book, because I was worried there wasn't going to be enough to it, and that it would simply be people, you know, everyone sitting down and saying, oh yeah, it was great, it was like going on holiday. And, you know, actually, it was a really, really good discussion. The villain of the piece for me was the father.
Yes.
I was so angry with him. Like, how awful and irresponsible to behave this way with your child, your only child. Your wife has died. Pack her off to boarding school. Don't see her for 12 years or something. And then when she comes back, treat her like one of your girlfriends, you know, in a way. I found that father-daughter relationship really disturbing.
Oh, that's funny. That didn't actually bother me very much. Partially because Cécile seems so all right with
she
it.
doesn't mind.
Yeah, she doesn't mind. What bothered me is that he's always going to keep switching between women. So I don't know if we're going to get into spoilers. I feel like we have to talk about the ending, Kate.
I don't want to spoil it too much. I can't.
But the ending is what makes it a great book club book.
Well, so Cécile ends up using what she knows about these players in the piece in order to effect this revenge that she wants to take on Anne. She basically uses her father's narcissism and preys on his feelings of being old and not attractive to women anymore. She uses Elsa and Cyril to sort of fake a relationship so that the father will see that Elsa's happy with someone else and want her back. And she uses Anne's sort of determination and drive, you know, against her. And then in the end, yes, it culminates in this, it's not direct, is it? But indirectly, Cécile feels herself responsible for Anne's death in a car accident.
Okay, good. We're going there.
Even after that, there's this idea that from this point, sadness has now entered her life. You know, she now understands about sadness. But she doesn't really care.
Well, and she admits it. She does care at the time, but she's sort of moved on.
Yeah.
When you were saying the father is the villain of the piece, for me, that was because he's the one who is really responsible for Anne's death. Whether or not, let's be honest, do you actually believe that Anne would kill herself in this situation? I mean, that seems so totally French, that this cool, successful, refined woman would drive herself off a cliff because the man who she loves, who was always going to have an affair, even if they were married, he was always going to have an affair, no matter what Cécile did or did not do. Is she really going to kill herself? Well, in France she is, because she's old now and, you know, she's off the shelf and her one last chance is gone and done with.
Yeah, she's like, what, 43 or something?
40 and still stunningly beautiful, but she has little wrinkles around her eyes.
Yeah, that's it. It's all over.
What I really loved is how self-aware Françoise Sagan is about what's happening between her characters. At one point she directly says, you know, you'll think that I have some sort of weird love for my father or that it might be my obsession with Anne herself, but no, I don't really think so.
My lovely old edition has an interesting bio of her in the back flap, which, given that it's not written like now with the benefit of hindsight, it was written a few years after this was published. It says, born in June 1935, the youngest daughter of a Paris metal parts manufacturer, Françoise Sagan wrote her first novel, Bonjour, Tristesse, at the age of 18 to prove that I was good at something. It's Viv Groskop, by the way, who said that she wrote it when she was 17 and it was published when she was 18. So who is right? Its impact was tremendous. Although critics hailed her as a marvel of precocity, they hinted it would be impossible for her to repeat her success. Her second novel, A Certain Smile, not only repeated her first success, but established her as an astonishing interpreter of the emotions of the sexes and as a real novelist. Her third book, Those Without Shadows, appeared last autumn. She has now become the idol of youth, and at 22 can claim to be the most celebrated living French person. She likes to drive fast cars and owns 5. She confesses a liking for speed, whiskey, jazz, and the English language. She's recently married a French publisher, Monsieur Guy Schuller.
She sounds
So that's
hilarious.
before she actually then had a very dramatic car crash that didn't die.
Okay.
Almost to the disappointment of the sort of French literary elite, you know, all the glamour, the mystique, you know, she could have actually survived. But anyway, and then went on to write. She was incredibly prolific. I think she wrote many, many, many other books.
Well, I love her writing.
Well, I think that's just what to me is so fascinating. Is it wasn't just a flash in the pan. She was really gifted and just sort of glamorous and interesting. You couldn't help but see why she was such a darling of the French cultural establishment, because it was all there in her. And indeed, Viv Groskop talks about how it's almost like the more you find out about Françoise Sagan, the more completely in her thrall you become. For my book club, it was a really good book club book. It was very nice to dip our toes into these waters. And then there was an interesting range of opinions from Sally and Amanda. Amanda liked it, but felt like it was a bit too much of its time to really transcend that and speak to her in the present day. But on the other hand, she said it was incredibly atmospheric and a pleasure to read. Andy said he was very glad to have read it. He enjoyed being the head of someone who is a bit of an alien being for him, being French, teenage, female, and a bit of a bitch. But he said it was a good read. Stuart gave it 5 stars.
Did he?
5 out of 5.
All
He said,
right.
I absolutely loved this. It blew me away right from the start, and I couldn't believe someone that age could write something like that. I found myself rereading lines and paragraphs as I went through, and I loved the exploration of the father-daughter relationship. That felt unique. He thought it was very well observed. He said, I think she did what she set out to do perfectly in just over 100 pages. It was just perfection.
Well, fair enough.
And I'm kind of with him on that,
I'm kind
actually.
of with him. I really enjoyed it the first time I read it by the pool. I very much enjoyed it on my sofa earlier today, and didn't want it to end.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's like, it would have been lovely if it had been like 3 times as long.
I'm going to read her other novels. I hadn't realised that she wasn't just a flash in the pan, that there are more books to dive into.
Well, my copy, and indeed I think that there's another Penguin edition, has her next book, A Certain Smile, in it. And Hannah in my book club read that. And she actually wasn't so transported by the descriptions of the Riviera, but when she read A Certain Smile, she said that really, really, really vividly took her to Paris, where she'd lived for a while, and she said she really felt that was very true and kind of took her back there. I think that was the other thing, you know, she wasn't just a flash in the pan. In fact, her next book was also good. And
Great.
yeah,
I'm there. I would keep reading her.
my friend Katie and I wrote a novel when we were 17. It was called Shadow of the Gloomy Lock. It was an attempt to write a Mills and Boon romance. It featured a hero called Rory MacLeith. What was his name?
Keep going.
Rory Campbell someone. The heroine was called Silvara MacLeith.
Do you have the manuscript?
It all took place on the shores of the Gloomy Lock. But, you know, we sat together and wrote like a few scenes, and then that was obviously the end of our literary careers. We never went anywhere. Françoise Sagan wrote this masterpiece.
I know.
That, you know, is still being read and discussed and enjoyed by people today and for many years into the future.
It is startling,
Yeah.
you know, the caliber of the writing, the insight of the writing. One of the things that always made me laugh as I was going through it is that Cécile is narrating this summer in retrospect. So you have the sense that she's maybe now 22, 23, 24, looking back at that youthful summer. What was it all about? But Françoise Sagan is still 17 when she's writing this. She doesn't actually have that retrospect.
No, it's true.
or that's presumed knowledge.
So, yeah, it was a great one. We loved it.
And it's very short. So if you need a perfect French palate cleanser for your book club, this is it.
Yeah. It's short, but with substance, which is always a really good thing for book club.
Inspired by Bonjour, Tristesse, here are some more recommendations for your next book club book.
Just to flag up again, the Viv Groskop book, Au revoir, Tristesse. Regular listeners to the pod will know I frequently mention Viv Groskop. She wrote a book about Russian literature that I really loved called The Anna Karenina Fix. And in Au revoir, Tristesse, she's sort of doing the same thing, but for the classic works of French literature. Each chapter takes you through a different author, talks about them, their biography, about the books that they're famous for, and just gives you a little potted summary. But it's all really entertaining and just a really fun companion, or even something to inspire you. Thinking about reading Proust, this might inspire you to actually do it. I also wanted to recommend, thinking about the Riviera and the atmosphere, I thought of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night, which I've read. Have you ever read that?
I actually don't know. I can't remember. I have an inkling that maybe I did, but would I remember it?
I feel like it's the sort of book where if you'd read it, you would remember it, but maybe that was just me. I've always found it a really extraordinary read. I've read it a few times. It's about a couple, Dick and Nicole Diver, who are incredibly glamorous, and they have this villa that they've rented on the French Riviera. And there's this American young actress, sort of ingenue, who gets drawn into their circle. And at the beginning, she's completely dazzled by their world, but gradually you start to realise with her that everything is not as beautiful underneath as it seems on the surface. And some really dark, troubling things turn out to be going on underneath. I mean, it's so dark. It's really sad in a way. I think there's a lot of truth in it from F. Scott Fitzgerald's own life and relationship with alcohol, and his wife Zelda is all very fraught. And I think a lot of that is in this. So it feels like it's just got that hard core of emotional truth to it. And yet it's also just so beautifully written. It just makes you want to weep. It's so good. And it's incredibly atmospheric. There is that kind of pleasure in it, just because it's also sort of effortless and glamorous. So I really recommend that one. I think it'd be a really good book club book. And again, it's not a long read. Don't know why we've gone off long reads so much.
I'm not sure why, actually, but keeping with that theme, I would quickly recommend Claudine at School by Colette. It is the perfect companion novel to Bonjour, Tristesse, because it is the portrait of the 16-year-old Claudine, who is in her final year at a country school. And on the back cover, it says, observant, impulsive, malicious, chastely sensual. Claudine becomes involved in an amazing succession of emotional experiences, from flirting with the young masters and being fondled by the visiting inspector, to the full-blown lesbian affair between Mademoiselle Sargent, the passionate red-haired headmistress, and Aimée, her tarty little assistant, for whom Claudine herself develops a schoolgirl crush. Very French.
There's a lot going on in that one.
A lot going on. And this is the first of 4 Claudine novels that really made her reputation. I can't recall when Colette took ownership of her works, because the thing about her is that her husband claimed he was the author of her books for many years, until she finally came out of the shadows when their relationship was dissolving and said, no, wait a second, they were mine. And French publishing world believed her, because her husband didn't write any more books, and she wrote many, many more after that. The other book I was going to recommend is actually more of a short story. It's a novella, and it's called Cheri, and it is set in that demi-mondaine world where you have these women who will never become wives. I'm always kind of like, why not? I don't know. They're very beautiful, very charming. I guess the thing is they're always slightly lower class. Is that it about the demi-mondaine?
I don't know.
I think it must be that they wouldn't be worthy of marriage, but, they are held up in the highest esteem in French society in their own right for being beautiful and charming. Now, the problem is that they age. So we have the same themes that are coming through, questionably, but, still coming through in Bonjour, Tristesse, this idea that women only really have social value until a certain age, and then they're just kind of pushed off. And in this case, it's the story of an aging demi-mondaine who has fallen in love with Cheri, a young gentleman. She's going to educate him in the ways of love. But really, how long can this relationship last, given that she needs to take a step back from society? Lots to discuss, I think, just about outdated and indeed offensive ideas of women and sexuality and their role in society. Another period piece, really, that gives you insight into kind of what makes French culture tick. That's all for this episode.
Our book recommendations were Cheri and Claudine at School, both by Colette, Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Au revoir, Tristesse by Viv Groskop. You'll find all these recommendations in our show notes, along with a list of any books that we mentioned in passing.
On our next book club show, we'll be discussing The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, the latest book read by my book club. First published in 1994 in Japanese, this modern classic is narrated by a young novelist living on a totalitarian island where the authorities wipe memories. To quote from the book's blurb, "Hat, ribbon, bird, rose. To the people on the island, a disappeared thing no longer has any meaning. When a young novelist discovers that her editor is in danger of being taken away by the memory police, she desperately wants to save him. For some reason, he doesn't forget, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for him to hide his memories. Who knows what will vanish next?" The Memory Police was only translated into English by Stephen Snyder this year, and then went on to be shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. It didn't win, but nonetheless has been heaped with praise. The Guardian writes, "It's a masterpiece, a deep pool that can be experienced as fable or allegory, warning and illumination." I'm so looking forward to discussing this one.
In the meantime, don't miss our latest bookshelf episode, in which we discuss the books we pick and choose outside of our book club reads. In our stacks this episode, I had Susanna Clarke's latest novel, Piranesi, a book club read to Calais in Ordinary Time by James Meek, and horror writer Shirley Jackson's family memoir, Life Among the Savages. Laura talked about Himself by Jess Kidd, was riveted by Peter Robb's History of the Mafia, Midnight in Sicily, and we talk guilty pleasure reads with Georgette Hayes' Masqueraders and Alison Croggan's Pellinor novels. That episode is out now.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email the Book Club Review at gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please do take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It helps other listeners find us and means you'll never miss an episode.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.